Hey.
Another episode of I Bought a Farm.
Yeah, man. Been looking forward to this.
Number 2. First of all, back by popular demand after number 1. In fact, almost too demanding. People are like, they're like, "Where's the next one?
We want it now."
Like, you're gonna have to start doing 2 or 3 of these a week. No, we're trying to work this into our schedule with the HUNTR podcast and everything else that we do.
Bear with us. Yeah.
We kind of knew, not in an egotistical way, but we kind of knew it was going to happen, right? Because it's such a cool subject to really get in and talk about, land ownership and the pursuit of land and, how you can even do it.
Yeah. Well, dude, so many cool things coming down the pipeline for us. Like in this regard, we've got some awesome guests lined up, some awesome properties that we've been keeping an eye on.
Yep.
And we're just excited to share that with you guys as we get into like this series. And, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. We obviously have a lot to talk about. This is it's a simple yet it can be a complex and nuanced, discussion when you start to dig into every different facet of what this entails. And so, as Jeremy said, bear with us as we kind of crank through these guests in an order that we think makes sense. And, we'll be releasing some of that with you via social media content and stuff in the meantime.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, it's so multifaceted. In fact, not a podcast, but a clip we put out, I kind of broke down like my thought process around the Ohio piece of ground I bought. That's on YouTube. It's on, I think, Instagram and Facebook
What'd you call that on? You should be Jeremy's brain dump.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was called. Yeah.
Jeremy's master spreadsheet.
It was basically my master of brain dumps. And like when you got into it, like all of the questions that started coming off of that from people that had watched it was like you've kind of realized the complexity in buying a property. In fact, I think if you're not thinking that way, if you're truly just thinking like, oh, I'm just going to buy that property, you either have a lot of money and you don't care, or you're not looking at it as truly an investment or as a big investment piece of it. But when you start to think about all the different pieces of a property and how you're going to utilize them or what the value is of them, it really breaks down. And one of those big pieces that came back a lot, and it was because it was a critical factor in the way I evaluated the Ohio ground, was timber.
Yeah.
And I even said in that video, and I think I've said in past, we both have, is like, I'm super naive to like how to calculate the value of timber. I've got a general estimate of kind of what I can see or what I know is valuable on a piece of ground. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, like, I can't look at a tree and be like, well, that tree's worth $750.
Yeah.
Like,
well, dude, and as hunters, we're fairly competent just growing up to say, wow, that's an oak, that's a white oak, that's a red oak. These are, white-tailed deer species of trees. Essentially, we're familiar with these, or apple trees, or cherries. Easily identifiable, tree species. But there's so much more to that, and especially when you start looking at, like you said, value, financial value, not just to a whitetail in terms of mass crop or soft mass. So it's really worth, I think, learning more about that, and there's all kinds of different apps, there's different resources. We're going to cover a lot of that today, but probably ultimately there is no better resource than to go directly to a forester, an accredited forester, who spent his life, studying all of those resources and walking the woods, knowing what's in your area specifically. It's important to have a regional forester, I think.
And I think it's never been more important, especially in a economy today where, I think timber prices are probably at the highest we've seen them in several years, if not a decade or more. And the other thing is that because there's such a demand for it, there's a lot of people who will come and approach you to say like, hey, I want to buy your timber. Like, let me look and buy your timber. So figuring out like what the process even is to get to that point, or, do I trust the first person that comes to my door and says, hey, I want to buy your timber, or like, is there a better way to go about it?
I think experience will tell you no.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do that.
Yeah. And I think that probably most people do, or the first person they call is the person they go with. And a lot of times that's a timber buyer, not even a forester in terms of who's valuing the stand to then potentially sell it off.
100%.
So today we've got Jed Coldwell, who's a buddy of yours from Ohio.
Good friend of mine.
And Jed is a state forester for the state of Ohio.
That's right.
And so what I think will be cool about talking with Jed is that there is a process to this, right? And there is a process to understanding the value. And it may not be, you may not have the flexibility to be able to do that prior to putting an offer or even purchasing a piece of ground. But even from that get-go of if I'm evaluating a piece of ground, how do I get a ballpark estimate, to maybe even where I'm at in Ohio now of like, okay, I own it. Should somebody cruise that now? Should I wait? Like what's the best option or best route for me to take at this point? Yeah. And I assume there's a lot of people listening to this who at some point will likely be buying ground that is mostly timber because we're hunters. And forestry in the timber part of it is going to be a huge aspect, not just from a wildlife management side, which Jed is a deer hunter, so he gets, but also from a revenue opportunity.
Yeah, no doubt. It's important too, and one of the things that I appreciate so much about Jed is that he is as passionate about deer hunting as he is about timber, which is his business. And so, you know, I've got every bit of confidence that when I ask Jed a question about how we should treat, you know, the timber on our property or on anybody that I recommend him to, I know that there's a consideration for, you know, financial value, you know, for conservation in the future of like what that woodlot will look like, and definitely the recreational aspect as well. And so it's not a one size fits all. You know, that's where a forester comes in to be able to say, hey, I realize you want to, you know, have value assigned to this timber. I realize you want to harvest some of this and maybe use that for a down payment on the property or something. And ultimately, you want to kill big bucks, you know, and that's something that Jed is very fond of. In fact, I killed my biggest buck to date on one of Jed's properties that he was kind enough to give me permission to.
How nice of him.
How nice of him indeed. And so, yeah, that's why he's on the podcast today, and we're going to learn something today.
All right, let's bring Jed up. Hey, what's going on, man?
Good morning, guys. Can you hear me?
We got you, brother.
Good.
I was just
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, Jed. I was just singing your praises there and kind of giving a little bit of background as to our relationship and, you know, forestry practices and how, you know, critical those are not only from a hunting aspect, but definitely from like a land investment aspect and whether that's initial or, you know, ongoing conservation of your land as it relates to gaining, you know, financial value for those or improving the hunting prospect, you know, and we couldn't think of a better guy to have on, obviously, than you. So welcome.
Well, I appreciate it. And, you know, I always tell clients of mine, so I'm a consulting forester for the viewers out there. Basically, I help work with forest landowners and help them make management decisions, help them decide, you know, when to harvest timber. And if they are harvesting timber, I can administer the sale through inventory, marketing, timber sale oversight. But I always start by trying to put myself in the shoes of my clients, which are landowners. And the fact that, you know, growing up and being blessed with the tree farm here that we've got in the family has been a great kickstart for that. But typically when I meet with a landowner for the first time, it's basically picking their brain. What are their goals and objectives for the property? And then, you know, basically, you know, walking the woods and then trying to, you know, work with them and come up with like a game plan on how best to get those, to meet those goals and objectives. And most of the time, you know, you can do that. Sometimes, you know, you have to have the conversation that sometimes it's just not a property that will lend itself to what they're after. But something
we've had a few of those.
Is that whereas maybe 15 years ago, typically when I'm meeting with a new client, you know, it was, hey, I want timber production. You know, that's my primary goal is long-term timber production. And then it seems like the last 10 years and even more the last 5 years, the individuals that are buying land are buying it primarily for recreational, primarily hunting and typically deer hunting reasons. Okay. So it seems like I've moved from kind of, yeah, let's grow timber to, hey, let's grow timber and shoot big bucks, which frankly, the two don't compete whatsoever. And you can do both of them and work them into the same property pretty easily. And frankly, even on my own property, you know, I got into, you know, I grew up deer hunting, but never really got into buck hunting until maybe 7 years ago. And at that point, you know, I look at my own property completely different and manage it different. It's not always, you know, let's cut out every junk tree in the woods, every triple forked maple. Now I find myself, hey, that could be a good stand tree. Let's leave some of those and just You know, it's changed how I look at properties, and I think it makes me a better forester when I'm out working with other landowners on their properties.
Awesome. Jed, how do clients like kind of come across you? And I guess I can preface that question with saying that, dude, the way that you and I met was that I was interested in timber stand improvement. I had heard this term like on Midwest Whitetail or somewhere, you know, on one of these shows that I was watching. It's like, man, TSI, you know, this is something you do in January, February, March. You know, it's so valuable to the you know, ultimately to the deer herd. And the idea behind that practice was that you're essentially cutting down, you know, non-desirable trees in order to, you know, achieve a couple of objectives, to open up the forest floor so that more things can grow, and to provide like immediate food and bedding, you know, in certain locations on your property. And so I was like all jacked up about this. This was, I don't know, Jed, 8 years ago, 6, 8 years ago, something like that. And
yeah, no, you're right. To be honest, before I met you, I don't think I'd ever shot a decent buck. You know, I was in that rut where I was shooting 3-year-olds all the time. But yeah, that's the time frame, to be honest, of when I kind of started getting into it myself.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. So what you're talking about, you know, non-commercial thinnings. To answer your question, I guess, go back. How do people get in touch with me? How do they know I exist?
Yeah.
It's referrals. It's word of mouth. You know, it's landowners who have used me either for a timber sale or a woodland stewardship management plan. Now, why they have to call me is a lot of times it's referrals, you know, not only from landowners, but from state foresters, whose really job it is to, so every county in Ohio at least has a state forester whose job is to educate landowners on forest management practices. Other than that, they kind of are restricted to be a little bit hands off. So they really end up giving a lot of referrals to consulting foresters like myself.
Gotcha.
So
we messed that up. So we messed that up initially, Jed. So you're not
what'd you say?
So you are not. We messed that up initially, or that was my misunderstanding. So you're not the state forester necessarily. You are a consulting forester for the state of Ohio.
I'm a private consulting forester. I have no affiliation, you know, direct affiliation with Ohio. Although I work with the state forester, who in this county is Ryan Cluster. You know, regularly. You know, it seems like we talk multiple times a week right now, especially when everyone's, you know, delving into EQIP and stuff like that. And so basically, his job is education. My job is to write plans, education, and then anything commercial. If we get into any kind of commercial aspect, that's where state foresters have to step aside. And then a consulting forester like myself, who works, again, my job is to work for the landowner. That's where I would get involved. But typically, a lot of times I'm meeting landowners because they're required to have a woodland stewardship management plan to be in either CAUV, which is agricultural usage valuation. It's the real estate tax savings program here in Ohio. And in some counties where they're kind of goofy, they'll require that you be an Ohio forest tax law for 3 years before you get into CAUV. Long-term CAUV is the program you want to be in Ohio because it's a better tax savings rate. So you're going to pay less on your real estate taxes in Ohio and CAUV than you would in Ohio forest tax law. It's the equivalent of Pennsylvania's clean and green.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then that West Virginia and other states have these. Pretty much all states have them. But that's kind of how a lot of times I get initial referrals. And then the other aspect is timber sales. So besides writing management plans, which is typically, again, in a management plan, it's breaking a forest down into stands based on growth, based on species composition and size class, and then making recommendations on how best to manage those stands. Typically grapevine control, invasive species control, poultry removal, all that stuff collectively is TSI. And then we get into timber sales, which is kind of its own thing, where if you're a landowner, and that's where, frankly, that's my bread and butter.
Yeah.
And what I want to be doing. And that's where I get, frankly, a lot of referrals from landowners that have used me for timber sales. I'll go on an inventory of woods, mark each and every tree to be sold, send out bid sheets to regional timber companies, oversee the sale. And the benefit of that is really the selection process. So I'm marking the stand, marking the trees to be sold based on the landowner's objectives, which is completely important in the process. Typically, timber in Ohio is sold and bought by timber companies on a diameter limit cut. Silly, stupid, generic, lazy is what a diameter limit cut. Okay, I'm not saying it doesn't have a place if you're in a point where you need to cut timber or sell the farm, then you might have to be aggressive, and maybe a diameter limit cut at that point is the best route to go. But if you're trying to manage for, especially, whitetail management, to treat all species, an oak as a maple, as a cherry, which have different growth rates, different maturity rates, and grow different on different sites, and to treat them all together and say we're going to cut them all at 18 inches. Half the time the landowner doesn't know if we're talking at 4.5 feet above ground or if we're talking at point of cut. It's just you're setting yourself up for cutting, but you might really regret your stand afterwards. And instead of having another harvest in 20 years, you might be 40 or 50 years down the road. And even then it might be, undesirable species versus your more desirable species.
Yeah. So Jed, I know a lot of us, including myself, who own property, have always had, I call them like the door knockers, basically. A guy comes up, knocks on the door. He's a timber, company. He's looking, hey, you've got some good white oak up on that hill. I'd be interested in cutting it. And that is assuming that's kind of when you talk about the selection process, that is that endpoint guy, right? That's a guy who's bringing a crew in to usually cut. It seems like, at least in my experience. And so I think
procurement forester is what you're talking about. Somebody whose job it is to represent the timber company. Okay. And there's good timber buyers out there. I'm not going to paint them all as a bad, I've got really good friends, and frankly, there's excellent companies that I work with that do a pretty good job, and they'll actually have a forester on staff and go mark stuff. Just be aware that they're representing their company. Okay. And just because they bought your neighbors and paid a fair price doesn't always mean that they're, always top dollar. Timing has a lot to do with this industry. And when I send out bid sheets, I send out to about 30 different regional companies. I've got, probably 10 that I work with extremely regularly. And it's not always the same one after another, that gets a bid. A lot of it has timing, who needs what, when, which is why you want to cast a broad net. But what you're talking about, the door knockers, they come in all shapes and sizes as far as quality. You've got some that are there to, some of those guys don't even have mills. All they're going to do is get you to sign a contract. They'll flip it to one of the guys that pays more money, and they made a quick buck in between. Then you've got some that are quality, quality buyers, and we'll go in and actually mark these. But again, the thing that I really want to warn against is that diameter limit cut that's generic. Landowners don't know what they're selling. It's a diameter limit cut. Okay, well, what does that mean? You don't know until it's gone.
Got it.
So what should somebody do if they're approached by like a buyer like that, and like, well, I'm not sure. I don't know what my, I don't know what my stuff is worth.
Lots of landowners then get into the game. Well, if I call 3, the best is, the highest number is the best option. That's not the correct answer. So it might just mean the highest number then becomes the guy that takes the most timber. Or frankly, there's what should they do is your question. They should call a consulting forester such as myself. They should call a state forester. They should get somebody that's trustworthy in the industry. And again, there's some really good timber buyers out there that will spend the time and do it right. But again, at that point, there's one company, and a consulting forester will bring you lots of good companies with good crews that do quality work. And again, the selection, and I really want to key in on that, because even in a woods that's fully mature, the trees per acre that come out on a north and east facing slope where the timber grows better because there's more moisture retention. There you might be leaving oaks that are 24 inches. Okay. Whereas on a south or west facing slope, which is more suited for oak, but they grow slower and they're closer together, you might be taking trees that are 20 inches to promote the growth of other trees, that other oak species that are that just need more space. The other thing that we've got to consider in forestry in Ohio is we're talking about 20 different species. Different species have different not only growth rates, maturity rates, they have different values. Okay. And again, that diameter limit generic cut, or maybe even somebody, an industry forester that wants to go through and mark your forest, guess what? They want the best. They don't want to take the jump 20 years down the road when you go to harvest again. Well, you've got a bunch of junk left. Okay. So that's where, again, a forester like myself and a consulting forester that marks the trees for sale, I can look at it from your perspective. When do you want your next harvest? What's realistic? And then make judgments based on that. I'm always, in this area, we grow lots of oak, and we grow red oak, white oak, scarlet oak, we grow pin oak in the bottom, we got chestnut oak, and they're not all worth the same. Okay, so I want to long-term try to weed the garden as I'm marking a piece of timber. I'm really hell on scarlet oak. I don't like it. It's 35 cents a board foot versus your red oak, which sells for 60 or 70. Your white oak's at $1.20 right now. I want to promote the growth long-term of red and white oak by weeding the garden, by getting out a lot of the scarlet oak, black oak somewhere in the middle between scarlet and red. I really take a lot more black oak out. I try to retain, again, if we're talking long-term management, we want to grow and reproduce your acorns, red and white oak. And then the other thing that I'm really big on is get the maple out.
Yeah.
If you want to grow more oak in a woods, you've got to get that mid canopy maple out. And now we're kind of getting out of, commercial harvesting. Okay. And a lot of what I recommend and for forest landowners who are into deer management is non-commercial thinnings. You can call it pole tree removal, crop tree release. I've got a whole category in my head called undesirable understory species, okay, which is your ironwood, your witch hazel, your spice bush, all this stuff that in large swaths of Ohio, at least, it's not always as simple as cut big tree down, small trees grow. Unfortunately, in our area, we've got this whole layer of undesirable. They're not invasive, okay, but they will just make this layer of cover in your understory that keeps your oaks from regenerating. So a lot of times I encourage landowners go in there before harvest, cut all that stuff, use herbicide, apply herbicide to the cut stump, and then have your harvest. Then you get that oak regeneration, and then in the meantime, get your maple out. In the hunting world, I know that hinge cutting is a big buzzword. That's fine. Hinge cut, anything that gets you to girdle a tree, cut it down, hinge cut it, don't care. Kill that mid-story maple. That way, again, we get that oak, the best chance we can to the oak seedlings and saplings to regenerate. Oak is a shade intolerant species, which means it needs a certain amount of light to grow. It'll sit there in the understory, it'll survive, but then if you get it the light it needs, it will come up. Okay, so that's why these non-commercial thinnings that I recommend, I always, be hard on your multi-fork, low-quality red maples, be hard on, there's no such thing as a good aspen, there's no point of it, cut it all down as far as I'm concerned. And then these undesirable understory species, be hard on them, and that's how you get your oak regeneration. And then that's, also you get browse, the amount of browse, deer, at least around here where I'm hunting, it seems like it's 80-90% big woods, 10-20% ag, and the deer that live, they just wander and they browse and they browse and they browse.
Yeah. How funny is it that that's the case, Jed? And we're 5 miles away from each other, and it's literally the opposite. I'm like 80% ag and pasture and 20% timber.
Yep. No, we're right on the border there. It is amusing. I was thinking of just last night, there's a landowner that I work with in central Ohio, Morrow County, that his woods, he doesn't really, he lets one person hunt it, but it doesn't get hunted. Okay. And this winter I was over there marking timber, and beautiful woods. And over there, they don't have that undesirable understory problem. Okay. It's amazing. You cut down maple and more sugar maple comes up. He's got beautiful, nice big red oak, a nice walnut. And that's good, but he's also got a browse line that's just so noticeable. This whole understory is nothing but a browse line.
Wow.
And I was in there and the 30 deer come running. A herd of 30 deer, okay, come running out of this woods. So sometimes it's just shoot some deer, you're going to improve your hunting, and you're going to frankly improve your understanding.
Yeah.
Jed, I think one of the things that people listening to this, including myself, are, maybe stuck on out of the gate is, I'm buying a lot of timber-based properties. Yeah, maybe it has a little bit of tillable, but in most of the areas I'm buying, it's primarily wooded, and timber ground. And I get into a piece of ground, and to me, as kind of the novice or even the naive, timber valued person, I'm trying to evaluate a stand of timber when I walk in there of not only like currently what it is, but what it could be. And for two reasons. To your point, I want a sustainable forest. I want something that's going to be better for deer hunting and for turkey hunting. But also because of an investment into that property, I'm also trying to say, well, you know, could I cut several of these white oaks, or could I cut some of these red oaks and recoup some of that money early, and then know 10, 15 years down the road, you know, what's left standing is going to be, you know, even more valuable. And it seems like, at least from the resources that we have out there, there's so many differing opinions. Like I've heard people right out of the gate say, you know, if you buy a piece of property, you want to get somebody to go on there and cruise that timber right away to give you a value now, so that when you cut it later, you don't have to worry about like a huge amount of capital gains tax, right? What was the value when you bought the property versus what was the value of the trees when you cut them? Is that accurate?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is a timber tax basis, and they are amazing. Okay.
I need one.
Well, I mean, it's not imperative, though, in my opinion,
okay,
that you run out and do it the year of that you buy it. So I do lots of timber tax bases. Frankly, it's just part of my conversation with landowners that are selling timber. How long have you owned this property? Okay. If the answer is anywhere, you know, north of 1995. All right, let's do you a basis. I can grow timber backwards. Okay. So basically I can cruise a stand and grow it back to the time of original ownership. And yeah, it's a huge savings. Now how a CPA or accountant uses that differs drastically. You
find a good CPA.
Taxes, yeah. 80,000 page, you know, tax code, different ways of doing so. But the ones that have aggressive, you know, CPAs and tax accountants, and you have a timber tax basis that's, you know, more than the value of the timber you sold, you probably shouldn't be paying taxes. Okay?
So does that mean
that's not my official
sure
IRS agents.
But a timber tax basis is a thing to basically set the value of the timber at time of purchase.
Wow, how cool is that? And that means as far as what you pay taxes on. So if I buy a piece of property in, you know, 2020, and I cut the timber in 2030, and I had a cash timber
tax basis,
a tax basis done, you know, in the year of 2021, I'm going to pay taxes on whatever was harvested in 2030 based on what it was valued at in 2021. Is that right?
In 2021, if your tax base is $100,000,
yep.
In 2030, when you sell the timber, you sell maybe just a select harvest, and you sell $50,000 worth, you should pay no taxes.
Right, because your tax basis was 100.
You show a capital loss. Okay.
Gotcha.
Now, and you've got 50,000 for your next harvest. That's one way of looking at it. I could just see the IRS agents out there like,
well, yeah. No, but I mean, that's a valuable piece of information.
It's extremely valuable. It's extremely valuable, and I'm getting to do more and more of these, especially for the Amish that are you know, they'll buy a piece, they'll harvest it, sometimes correctly, sometimes very aggressively. But the one thing they know is they're going to pay tax on that, and they're starting to wake up to the fact that a timber tax basis with a good accountant, that's part of this, okay, will save them typically, you know, 15%. That's your typical capital gains right now, and that obviously is in flux right now with, you know, depending, you know, policy.
And is that something
I wanted to bring up here, and that's very important.
Yeah, for sure. Is that something, Jed, that can be accomplished with like an initial consultation? So if a landowner calls you and they're like, hey, you know, I bought this piece of ground, I'd like to do a timber tax basis. I'd also like to do probably a thinning. I'm trying to harvest for whitetails. Like, do you in your mind have like all of this stuff kind of in the back of your head as you go out for an initial walk, and you say, all right, you know, we're going to accomplish all these goals with one walk of the property?
No, not realistically, not unless it's a small property, because especially with timber tax basis, you know, there's a degree of accuracy. I've got to do sample plots. It's got to be, you know, documented how I'm doing this, and it's got to be legit. So just a walkthrough won't work for that, because I mean, I guess it could if the, you know, landowner wants to hang out with me and watch me do some boring sample plots and stuff like that. But it's typically, if I'm doing an initial walkthrough, I can write a management plan from that. You know, I can take notes that are detailed to write you up a management plan, but a timber tax basis, and definitely not a timber sale. A timber sale is its own animal where I'm coming back, you know, depending on the side of the property, typically multiple days to inventory, mark the trees, scale the board footage, and do that whole thing. Mark property boundaries, work out ingress, egress, which is drastically important, very important sometimes.
How does compensation work for that, Jed? Is there kind of a flat rate that a consultant would charge?
So basically, when I'm doing a timber sale, I work on a 10% commission. So I do inventory, marketing, timber sale oversight, handle the sale, do the contract work, provide the landowner with a good landowner-friendly contract. I get paid a 10% commission. That's the point where some landowners, I'm not paying that, and I can do it myself. Well, sometimes you get what you don't pay for. The other thing, if I'm doing a management plan, if I'm doing a timber tax basis, at that point I work on an hourly rate, and it just depends on sometimes how busy I am. But I can give you a quote, as a landowner. I usually try to keep my rates for that, extremely reasonable, especially for management plans, because management plans and relationships lead to
timber sales.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Jed, one thing that seems like, at least in today's kind of marketplace, is it seems like the value of timber, some trees more than others, but is extremely high right now. And, I've heard people discuss basically selling stands on their property as, I guess, standing timber now for future harvest. So basically going in and marking timber that, and selling it to somebody that, maybe doesn't want to cut it this year, but 5 years from now, like, it will be prime for cutting, and essentially they're paying today's prices. Is that something that's common?
It's not in this part of Ohio.
Okay.
Now, I know that the further south into Ohio you go, and definitely into other states, the timber contracts and timber rights are their own different animal. It's not common whatsoever right here in this part of Ohio, and I hope it stays like that. To me, that seems, frankly, like, obviously timber is going to grow.
Yep.
And frankly, from the buyer's standpoint, it seems like a gamble. And from the standpoint, it seems like a gamble. And then, especially if that landowner isn't the landowner when the timber's harvesting, it sounds like a nightmare. Okay. Yeah. So if you've got timber sold, timber rights are here, landowner sells, the next landowner is going to have to deal with potentially this harvest that they might know what it entails, might not. I hope that doesn't become common, but I know it is a thing. Again, when sometimes I'll peruse real estate in West Virginia and Kentucky, and timber rights is always a thing, that's brought up. It just is. I don't want to think about.
yeah, that there's a contract on it. I guess and let's flip that back to kind of what you're seeing more on your end. From the time a landowner calls you and says, "Hey, I've got some timber I'd love for you to take a look at and maybe potentially do a select harvest on it," what does that timeline look like from your engagement through the crews and the marking to the actual sell and cut, basically?
Great question. So typically, if I'm meeting with the landowner, sometimes I'm 3 weeks out, sometimes I'm 3 months out. It just kind of depends. So basically, from the time though that I am engaged with the landowner and get in there and mark the timber, at that point, I inventory it. I send out bid sheets to regional timber companies, give them about 1 month to view the timber on their own, come out, look at the timber. They're going to kind of match up the quality that they see out there, access issues with the inventory sheet that I give them. Bids are due on a specified time and date. At that point, within 2 weeks of that point, we have a timber sale contract signed. Typically require 25% of the payment of the bid down, full balance before removal, which is always very important. And then typically the rule in Ohio has been a 1-year removal contract. I am encouraging my clients right now, if let's go 1.5 years when possible. Okay. Because right now it seems like there's been so much, the market's hot. Lots of landowners are selling timber. Might not be enough. We want to encourage bidders. Okay. So right now I'm encouraging landowners to when applicable and when possible, to go 1.5 year contract. A lot of times, it seems like 40% of the time, at least right now, it seems like a lot of times landowners are carving out, all right, I'm going to restrict harvesting in September, October, November, December for deer hunting. That's fine. If you're the landowner and you want to do that, that's fine. Sometimes landowners feel compelled when they have lease land to hunters to do that. And to me, that's kind of the tail wagging the dog. I kind of discourage that, but that's up to them. If they want to do it, that's fine. But if we're going to take 4 months away, let's give it to the timber company on the back end. Again, we want to encourage, your quality companies who have a lot of timber bought up to bid on your timber.
Mm-hmm.
But that's in generic fashion. Within a year and a half, you're going to have, timber harvester or logging crew in and working. Landowners always, it seems like every time I work with a landowner or meet with an initial landowner initially, hey, I want this done in, winter or summer,
right.
dry or cold. Everybody wants their timber harvested in dry or frozen conditions. The
Yeah.
loggers want to work in dry or frozen conditions. Realistically, timber is harvested year round. Okay. It's just patience has got to be a key. This last month has been the wettest month in a while. Okay. And a lot of I've had 3-4 different logging crews in the woods that I've been kind of checking in on that are on my jobs. Most of these guys are working 1-2 days a week, and the ones that are working a little bit more, they've got a wide track dozer and ground conditions that are suitable to work with a wide track dozer. So sometimes the equipment comes into it. Well, equipment always comes into it, but typically these crews are showing up with a skidder and a dozer. Dozer is going to be a lot less impact on wet ground. But I guess just for the listeners out there, landowners out there, sometimes you're going to have a logging crew on your property in less than desirable conditions. But that's where you got to rely on your forester
mm-hmm.
to convey to the timber crews that, hey, let's be patient. Sometimes you end up with some mud. I've got one crew that finished up early this week, and they did a really nice job on 95% of this property. They've got a little stream crossing. I guess it's very small, perennial stream that they're going to have to come back in the summer and do some dozer work just to clean up to make it the way it needs to be, because it just, the conditions weren't good enough to do the reclaim, right now. So sometimes
mm-hmm.
that happens. Not normal, but it's sometimes that's part of it.
Since you mentioned reclamation, Jed, how often does it happen that a landowner is like, hey, while these crews are in here, like I'm trying to put a food plot over in this corner, or, there's something specific I'd like to do with this, section of woods as it relates to my deer hunting. Is that something that like forestry crews are flexible on, or that you can, consult on as a part of your deal? How's that work?
I always, it comes up a lot. Okay. And I always remind landowners that, that forestry, the loggers are loggers and not excavators. Okay. That being said, a lot of these guys are really good people. And if you've got a little, small little quarter-acre piece like that, that you want cleared, it's probably not unreasonable to ask it. I always keep that separate from the timber sale contract. Okay. Now, while they're there, I don't think it's wouldn't be out of the question to say, hey, for a couple $100, can you do this? But it's something that I don't want to muddy the waters too much.
Sure.
These guys are here to cut timber and that's how they get money. That's their bread and butter. And bottom line, I will never, speak for a crew before the crew is on site and promise the landowner something like that. That's not my place.
Sure. I think what's so super critical is like anybody that's listening, and just because I have one specific property that is more of an investment piece, understanding that, this thing is likely going to take, a year and a half from start to finish at least. People that are thinking, well, I want to buy this place and in 3 or 4 years I want to sell it. Like this is a process that you don't want to sit on for too long, because if you do, you're going to essentially have just taken timber off, and your property might look a little bit rough after that timber's been taken off. But when you put it on the market, and how many times have we seen that, right? You see somebody go in and log really heavy or cut really heavy, and immediately after put that property in the market, and it could still be a really good property, but aesthetically, it doesn't look good, right? If I'm a buyer and I'm going in and I'm like, man, they just tore the shit out of this place.
Yeah, even though deer hunters generally like to see the tops left, like within a year, it still looks kind of
it looks pretty rough,
unpresenting for sure.
I always tell landowners, even on very select harvest, I guess that's part of just my general speech is I'm trying to manage landowner expectations, and based on the kind of harvest that we're talking about, I've gotten pretty good at doing that. But even a select harvest, there's nothing pretty about a timber harvest. Okay. but in aggressive harvest, around here, it seems like portable sawmill operations are becoming more common. Those look like just nightmares. Okay.
Yeah.
You've got this anything that you can make a 2x4 out of. And frankly, it can be kind of frustrating from my standpoint, because it can be a nice stand of pole size and small saw timber oak that's got all the potential in the world in 20, 25 years. And landowner will call me and I'll say, it really needs more time. And then I'll go by a year later and it's just gone because portable sawmill, it's $1,000 an acre, and then the landowner's like sees $1,000 an acre. But getting back to your point about, selling property after a harvest, there's really something magical about 5 years, in my opinion. You get the tops breaking down, you get that next generation of understory coming up, and it seems like a lot of even aggressive harvests 5 years later, it makes a huge difference. So I guess a landowner that's potentially going to sell your timber and then sell the property, man, if you can time that, if you've got 5 years to work with, that would be my recommendation.
As long as we're talking about, timing of those harvests. I know, Jeremy, you mentioned like capital gains consequences, like potentially within the first year.
Yeah. Well, and per what Jed's telling us or informing us here, because I didn't know, is like, it doesn't sound like by the time you buy a piece of ground, engage a forester, get the cut,
to do it anyways,
under a year to where you'd pay short-term capital gains, right? Because that's the thing, is if you sell that timber under a year, you pay short term. Anything over a year is subject to long term.
If you sell it or if you harvest it, or is it one and the same?
I think when you start to receive that money.
Okay. Well, and so when does the landowner receive funds? I know you said like 25% down when somebody wins a bid. Is that the right timing? And then the remaining balance before harvest, which obviously you've got a year and a half to do. When does the landowner see that money?
I guess I want to clarify too, if any listeners are out there thinking that a harvest will take a year and a half, that's not what I'm saying. A harvest, they're going to, if you're selling 100,000 board foot of timber, typically, and it depends drastically on terrain and topography and weather. But typically, if they're working, most logging crews are going to average 8,000 to 10,000 board foot a day. So 100,000 board foot, you're talking, 10 or 12 days of harvesting of good weather to harvest. I wanted to put that out there before,
But it is the process, Jed. I'm saying that year and a half or so process from the time we engage a consulting forester to cruise it, to put the bids out, it can take up to a year and a half, basically, before the cut's complete.
Well, and let's go back to that real quick, Jed. I want to make sure I understand that. So the year and a half is more appealing to the crews than a year because it provides them ample time, like against their other jobs, to say, it's realistic for me to get that done.
Correct. So if you're a timber company that's got, 9 months of timber bought up, 9 months of contract that you've got to get to, and it's only a year contract, you've got to think, well, if it's really a wet year, am I going to get to it? Okay. So it might scare away a bit. It provides timber companies flexibility.
Sure.
Okay. Options are good, and anything economic, options are good. And it provides them with more options of when to cut it. And it promotes the ability to get more bids. It's not always necessary. Just right now, it seems like there's so much timber on the market for so long that right now, I think it's important.
Okay. And so we've got a couple different timelines kind of stacking up. It's like you want, 4 to 6 years is your ideal time frame after a cut if you're looking at selling a property in terms of aesthetics of the piece.
Yep.
You also want to avoid within the 1 year time frame, the short-term capital gains, collecting money. And so,
but if you have a timber tax basis, then you may not have to pay anyways. It may be irrelevant.
The basis should undo that short term. That's my understanding. But again, consult your CPA. And if your CPA says it doesn't, then you wait a year, then you sell timber.
Yeah.
It's not that.
Gotcha.
I think
to be honest, it's not very common for a landowner to call me and the first thing they need is a timber sale. That's not common at all. Typically, if I'm on a property with a landowner that just bought it, I can usually give them a list of reasons why they should do other stuff prior to a harvest. You do a little bit of grapevine control prior, you're going to save yourself lots of headaches later. Again, a little bit of prep work, get that understory correct. You're gonna improve your ability to grow your desirable species. Again, it's very rare, and typically it's more for the economic minded that you just buy it, harvest it, and move, and then get into the other management. You can do it, but so around here, if I'm buying a property really close by, that the goal is long-term management. if I'm buying a property, down the road, I'm buying it more as, options. Right now it might be investment, or maybe maybe I'll keep it long term. Maybe, it's just going to appreciate and maybe I'll sell it in 5 years. I'm not sure, but I always manage it. It's too easy to manage your property. Okay. Yep. So I'm always going to take the steps I need to do management. Again, grapevine control, culture removal, tree planting, and a lot of applications, invasive species control. That way, I don't care if I own it 20 years or 20 months, the next person is going to have it makes your property more valuable, to be honest. Resources out there that make it, pretty easy to manage it. There's a program called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And I guess I want to, kind of caveat how much I plug this, because it seems like recently it's not always as easy to work with that program as maybe it has been in the past. But it's a program that basically, once you get a woodland stewardship management plan, then you can potentially get funded through EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, through your NRCS office. It's part of the Farm Bill, basically money designated to this program. Then the states allocate it, some to ag, some to forestry. But basically, if you get funded, you can get all the recommendations in your management plan funded through the federal government through the Farm Bill. Okay. And again, that's why, when I get a property, that's one of the first things I'm going to do is do that management plan, try to work through EQIP, get all that stuff done, for free. And typically, historically, they've been allocating enough money where there's really no out-of-pocket expense to myself. I'm not making money on it, okay, and I don't think landowners should make money on it, but you can get enough money to pay a vendor. And that's the other thing. We are blessed here in Ohio, in this part of Ohio. We've got really good vendors doing quality work, doing the TSI for the contract price.
So interesting. So Jed, you're saying that a landowner can use the EQIP funds to then subcontract out a vendor to perform the management actions on the property.
That was going to be my next question, is like who's doing that work?
Because that's hard, man. I mean, Jared and I are I would say ample TSI guys. Like, we love it. It's fun. It's great to get out there.
There's time is the limiting factor.
Yeah, I mean, I look at, going through in TSI in an acre and a half, and I'm thinking of how much I still have, and it's like, I just don't have time. Mm-hmm. I wish I did. I just don't.
At some point, it becomes daunting. Okay, you're exactly right, and I think most landowners like the idea of doing some themselves. Well, this is what I tell them: do the grapevine yourself, because that's you see vine, cut vine. Put herbicide on the cut stump, simple. The second you get into, culture removal, and you guys are probably more than capable at it, but when you get into culture, you need to know your species, and you need to honestly know your tree species. You can't be like, I think I know. Okay, be honest with yourself. If you can't tell just by a glance, it's a maple versus an aspen versus an oak, you have no business doing culture removal, because you're going to do more damage than good. Okay, I'm always, hell on sassafras.
The same applies to deer, right, Jed?
But sassafras looks like walnut, the bark, just enough to the novice landowner.
That 3-year-old looks like a 6-year-old.
All in the eye of the beholder.
That's where I'm not trying to discourage landowners from doing the work themselves. Frankly, there's huge benefits to that. It's more time in the woods. You're going to find deer trails that you didn't know were there. You're gonna make discoveries out there that are going to help you be better hunters. But there comes a point where you want to also enjoy your property. And if you're looking at it like a chore, EQIP is for you, my friend, because again, subcontract, take that money, get the work done by qualified, good people that know their species and know what they're doing, and just sit back and be like, sweet, that's done, it's good stuff. Cool. And frankly, they're getting too many options, in my opinion, because I'm writing these plans still based on forestry, and I'm being told about all these wildlife applications and these different options, that are more wildlife based. And it's kind of making my head spin on the different codes I need to use when I'm writing these things. And it's a good program as long as you've got a really good, DC district conservationist in your county, which 90% of our local DCs are really excellent. There's a handful that are boners, and you just don't want to work in those counties. But for the most part, these are really good people that'll work with you. And right now the funding's really good. So it seems like, and it's different by counties. There's some numbers games that unfortunately that comes into this. And sometimes it's dependent on the DC playing the numbers game, maybe better than a different one. It's very competitive, but just generically, it does seem like, whereas maybe, 5 or 10 years ago, it seems like maybe only 20% of the people that applied for this got funded, which made it hard for me to push it, because it's like, hey, you got a 75% chance of wasting your time. It's hard to plug that. But right now it's 75% of landowners, forest landowners, are getting funded. So, hey, awesome. Go for it. And now, unfortunately, I'm plugging it probably to the point where, there's probably going to be more people applying, and I don't know if we're going to stay at that 75% rate, but it's an option, good option to get a lot of men.
And did I hear that right? So you said this is all federally funded through the Farm Bill. And so is this EQIP also available through like where we're at in Pennsylvania?
Probably.
And is it called the same thing?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program.
Yep. Gotcha.
Yep.
Awesome.
Jed, one thing I think that, I've always had the question of, and it's going to be case by case basis, but we've even heard it just in some of the initial conversations we've had through the I Bought a Farm podcast. But people will say, well, yeah, I had, a company come in and they select cut this 40 acres and I got 90 grand. And then this guy says, I had this 40 acres select cut and I got 120 grand. It's like, is there, I won't say like a rule of thumb, but if you could maybe give us a scenario of like, here's a stand of 40 acres. It's mostly made up of white and red oak, at X diameter. Like, how would people even begin to think about, not necessarily like an accurate value, but just ballparking, like what that stand looked like and is worth?
The next question beyond that, Jed, too, is like, dude, when you're purchasing a property, a lot of times there isn't, especially in this market, time to consult a forester. It's like you've got one chance to go out and look at it. And as I'm not a forester, I'm not a forestry consultant. How can somebody go out and walk a property briefly and have a ballpark of how much they might be able to harvest and apply towards a down payment on the property? I think is the big question.
And I'll preface it by just my own case. And so I've got 130 acres in Meigs County, Ohio that I just bought, Jed. And I've got some really great white oak ridges. And that was, the first thing that when I was getting up on these ridges and stuff, and I'm, it's not, I won't say they're giant. They're not 50-inch DBH trees, but
it doesn't take a forester to say there's some value here.
Yeah, they're 30 to 40-inch DBH white oak trees that haven't been cut. Like, none of this stuff's been cut in 35 plus years, and so I'm looking at it as that seems like there's some value here, but I don't know, right? It's a guesstimate from my end.
So you said 30 to 40. I'm sorry to call you out on this.
No.
I saw Jed's eyes glaze over with money signs.
Yeah. Most of them are 30-plus-inch DBH.
Not circumference, diameter.
Diameter, yeah. There's a couple. I mean, and I say most. I mean, some of the bigger ones in that area are that. I would say that most of them are probably in that, I don't know, 18 to 26,
Okay, gotcha. So this is just, but yeah, you've got a mature stand of white oak.
I've got a lot of mature white oaks there.
Your question is completely loaded, and my answer is I can't.
Well, that's good. That's what we want to hear.
We know.
We want to hear that.
Just and the fact that you say Meigs County, you're so far south that's out of my even area. I know the timber's down there is worth a lot less than it is up here.
Yeah.
Your end game to good markets is just further. That being said, white oak is king of the mountain, and it's got to be worth something pretty good, and especially if you've got, even white oak in the 20s, DBH, you've got something of value up here. White oak itself, before we get into it's a board foot low end, $150 if it's nice big stuff. So it even right here, it varies by a drastic amount. And then more broadly, your question, is there any generic number? No, there's too many variables, different species, even within the oaks, again, pen oak, 10 cents, scarlet oak, 35, black oak, 50, red oak, 75, white oak, $1.20. And then that's before you even get into other species, aspen, nothing, beech, 15 cents. There's just so many variables. And then we're talking about size class, stalking level, how many trees per acre are there, how many trees per acre are ready to harvest. It's and as much as you probably hit the ball on the head by saying you can't in today's market, always get a forester to look at a piece. That's really your best bet, is to get a forester to look with you, and for a reasonable rate, I bet you they're going to be able to point you in the direction. Round number, they don't really have to do sample plots or anything like that. Just cruise a piece, walk it, and be like, hey, round numbers, this is what you're worth now, this is what you're worth in the future. Just to help you.
I'll twist your arm a little bit on the question. So like if it just is impossible, I mean, what advice would you give to a potential buyer who has a limited time frame to go out and decide if he wants to buy the property or not? Just, obviously he's not going to be able to come up with a number in his head to say, well, it's this or that. But generally speaking, you've already told us oaks are higher value than other trees. So if he can determine, hey, oaks are higher value than these, that's good. What else can they do?
Walnuts.
Bones. You need the bones. Okay, so you species composition is a large part of it. So you want walnut, obviously, if possible. Poplar's good. Poplar's not the value of oak, but it's not bad. We're talking right now, I haven't sold a piece of poplar for under 45 cents a board foot for over a year and a half now.
Wow.
And what poplar lacks, and it's not red oak value, but it's pretty good. It just grows, man. It grows quick.
I was say it grows fast and it grows straight.
You're right, and it grows volume per acre. Whereas your oaks a lot of times will top out at 2.5, 3 logs high. Your poplar is 3.5, 4 logs high. So it's volume per acre. So again, I guess generically I would say the bones, the species composition, and then the bigger the better. Other than that, site.
Before you move from that, Jed, what tools can people use? I realize a simple Google search could probably turn some of this up, but is there an app, a specific resource you like for people to reference, different tree types?
I have no idea.
Oh. No idea?
Jed's brain.
No, I don't know. Go on the internet and Google it. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I know, Virginia Tech has a good dendrology website. I think somebody told me years ago. I don't know.
Cool.
I know my tree. I don't.
You don't use an app?
Well, and I think when the poplar thing's an interesting thing, because that's always been in a lot of the properties that I own. I don't want to say my nuisance tree, but it seems like my poplars are everywhere. And then it's like, oh, there's a white oak or there's a chestnut oak, and then it's poplar in between. Again, to your point, Jed, I think it makes sense when you start talking about the number of trees per acre on a poplar side. There is some value there, and there's not a lot of wildlife value to that tree standing there. So why not cut it? Go ahead.
Right. You can put maple into that. So poplar, maple, cherry, I'd say if you're trying to manage for, deer habitat, you can thicken up your understory. And encourage regeneration of oak just by really getting rid of those 3 species and leaving your oak. You're going to get acorns. You're leaving your hard mass. You're thinning your canopy. The more canopy oak gets, the more fruit we get, the more acorns we get. So
How about hickory?
Hickory's somewhere in the middle. I still kind of I like hickory because I like squirrels. I like squirrel hunting, and squirrels will bury all your acorns. But early season, they're going to hit the hickory nuts. And it doesn't have the value, I guess, maybe it's right there with poplar, really. It's 40, 45 cents, which is a heck of a lot better than we were 20 years ago at 20 cents a board foot, where it stayed forever. So we're better off now and markets are always changing. Regionally, it's just amazing to me. The market changes just even from here to 20 miles southeast of here. If you go across the river into West Virginia, prices drops 50-60%. I mean, the competition's not there. They've overregulated themselves to the point where nobody wants to go over there from Ohio and harvest. So I mean, it's really amazing. They've got quality stuff for the most part, but there's no competition. So the prices are worth a lot less. The road infrastructures, they've got state routes over there that look like county roads here. So it all adds up to kind of just this, low value timber over there.
Interesting. So I was going to say,
I'm going to clarify something, Jed, since you mentioned the squirrel hunting. This little deviation here. Remember I sent you that picture of that black squirrel a while ago? It was like a month ago. I sent you a picture of a black squirrel in one of our food plots, and you responded, "Damn Canadians."
Oh yeah. Okay, I do remember.
And I responded like with a laughing face as if I got it. I didn't get it. Is that a joke?
So no, I think they come down from Canada.
The black squirrels?
So a black squirrel, I think, is a phase of a gray, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. But I do think that it's a phase that came in from Canada. I might be wrong there, but either way.
I see. I had no idea what you meant by that. I was like, maybe it's a typo, so I just pretended like I got it.
Also, he's all soaked up in maple syrup or something.
Yeah. I see quite a bit of them now. A lot of black squirrels.
Jed, you mentioned like the value in certain areas changing a lot. Is there a primary resource to follow like the timber value pricing and stuff, much like I guess the stock market? I guess
there is. I mean, there's really no like. So there's the hardwood market report, which isn't going to deal with stumpage, okay, which is what landowners are interested in.
Right.
You can work it backwards to make it. The hardwood market report's good for trending. You can say, if something going up or down. For stumpage, we've got the, what do they call it? This thing.
Yeah.
The Ohio Extension puts it together, and basically it's a survey of timber companies and foresters. Frankly, I think it's gotten a lot more accurate since they added foresters to the survey process, where basically I think once every quarterly they'll send out a questionnaire of, hey, what's the average stumpage prices. The problem is it's from 6 months ago, so it's always 6 months behind. Mm-hmm. But I'd say it's moderately accurate, and it's got it broken down by state and species and even range within state. But it really just, again, it's 6 months old. It's something to go on, but it's not something that I would, if I'm a landowner, point to and I would caution you from going by it, because again, it's 6 months old, and it's just not. It's not really accurate. Like there's prices on here that, I think for the most part I'm getting, if it's quality red oak, 80 cents on the most, maybe 75, 80 cents. And that's, I think got it listed at 65. So if it skews, it typically skews a little bit low.
Well, and I mean, that seems like the value from your consulting forester position is that when you put those bids out to all of these different regional groups, the fact is they're going to determine what the market price is at that time.
You're exactly right. So basically it's the market price is set by the high bid. That's it.
Interesting.
Awesome. It's just like anything. I mean, it's like, real estate or insurance or, if you go right to the place, you don't have an agent working on your behalf to, like you said, get bids from multiple places to ensure that you're getting taken care of on the best value for, the resource that you have on your property. So,
well, and I think back to your point of like, when you're looking at a property and it does move fast, you just need to educate yourself to say like, here's a stand of white oaks and they're not, 10-inch diameters. They're in the high teens or low 20s. Like there's value there, or to Jed's point, composition. If you're having to walk through a ton of, ironwood and beech and stuff to find a single oak, that stand's probably going to be a lot less than if you were walking through and it was all oak in that area. So, I think that as you're visualizing the property, and the hard part for most of us is we're looking at it from a hunting standpoint, right? We're walking in and we're trying to figure out like, how's this layout for hunting? What's the potential? What's the sign look like? But, to the point of funding the other securities to really, make that a smart investment property, timber in most of our cases is going to be that asset. And so just being able to recognize what's standing on the property and if there's value there and what's the composition, you're going to have enough of a ballpark to say, you may not be able to say, hey, I think there's $80,000 worth of timber on this property.
Yeah.
But you can at least say like, there's value here. And if it's not here right now, in 5 years or 10 years, it probably will be here.
Jed, is there a way?
Guys, it's very rare you're going to walk into a piece that is ready for a harvest. It's just, landowners that are selling property, typically they harvest it first. That's very common. So it's just, again, it's very rare that you just walk into a piece that's ready to harvest. And I'd say on average, if I had to throw out an average number, I'd say, if you buy a new property realistically, on average, you're probably 20 years out plus.
Yeah. Jed, is there a way, I know we keep going back to like, how do you do a forester job as not a forester? Would it be appropriate or realistic for somebody that's looking at buying this piece of property and they're like, hey, could I just look up my local forester in the area or forestry consultant and say, hey, I'm looking at buying this piece of property. I just walked it. There's a bunch of red and white oaks. There's approximately this many of them. They seem to be about this big, and will a forestry consultant give some kind of consultation on that, or a rough appraisal based on a phone call?
I wouldn't, but I'm not saying that some wouldn't, or maybe some other consulting foresters would, but I would not, because it's just okay, you walked into how much of it. There's just no degree of accuracy there that I could trust. I mean, at that point, and I do this a lot, not a lot, but I've done it multiple times in my career where somebody's looking at a piece of property. Hey, come give me just a walkthrough, ragtag estimate of what this is worth now or potentially worth. So that's still your best bet. And there's a pile of consulting foresters around here now. I don't feel like we're all so busy that that's not a reasonable expectation that if you call enough, you're going to get somebody that's credible, that can give you a realistic number. And I think that's probably
I think one thing that would be interesting, and I look at this in terms of some of the like investment properties we're looking at, and Jed, maybe you even do this, is that to your point of, oftentimes you're going to walk into a property and it may not be ready to harvest for another 20 years. I think that in most cases, if you buy a property, it's probably not coming with some sort of certified appraisal of that timber when you buy it, right? I have seen some listed, and it's like, hey, this was appraised, and there's $175,000 in timber on the property, right? All inclusive. But most of these places don't have that. So even if you get somebody to come out as a consultant forester to say, hey, I'm thinking about cutting it, but when you get done with that cruise, you may come to the conclusion that, hey, listen, you're not ready to cut it. But 10 years from now, this is what that value could look like. When you sell that property, even though you didn't remove that timber, you have a very nice asset in the certification of that appraisal of that timber to say, or, here's what it is.
The flip side of that is like, I think like your question is that value of the timber that's on a property always realized at the sale? Or would you as the landowner or potential seller be better off to harvest that, and then 5 years later when it's looking presentable, just sell it for what you would sell it for and have recouped the value on that timber already?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So guys, I mean, as far as, if I'm buying, I'm trying to buying land, I'm trying to find that deal where the seller doesn't realize the value of the timber, that's on the property that they probably should have sold before they're selling the property.
Yeah.
That's kind of, there's a whole industry in Ohio around that, where there's a handful of people that are very good at finding those niche properties that have timber value on them, selling the timber and then selling the property for exactly what they purchased it for. They get the timber for free.
Yeah. Right? When you say sell it, they're actually timbering the property and then selling the property, not selling the rights to the property or to the timber.
No, they're selling the timber.
Yep.
They're harvesting the timber, selling it.
Yep.
And then they're selling. And it's harder and harder now, guys, because more and more, again, if you've got, if you got $100,000 in the bank right now, you're getting $7 interest, So right now, I feel like lots of people are running to land. Okay. So it's harder and harder to find those deals out there.
Yeah.
Where, I feel like I'm 10 years too late. Okay.
Yeah.
Where you can't just go out and do that and start a business doing that. So but yeah, if you're a landowner, realistically, that's got property, you should give it 5 years and you should sell that property. That's how you maximize, in my opinion.
Jed, we had a guy, Bill Winke is the old host and owner of Midwest Whitetail, that told us he was talking to a forester from Iowa. That's where he's from. And I don't know how far back it was. It was like maybe 40 or 50 years. But he said at the time, a guy, had he realized the value of the timber, could have purchased like the entire state of Iowa and made money, based on the timber value. Does that sound right?
I'm not.
So where do we do that now?
Well, I still think, I mean, to Jed's point, it is harder. I still think there are things like I look for key things in descriptions when I'm looking at properties. In fact, even though, the value may not be as high in Meigs County, the interesting part of that was it was owned by the same people for over 35 years or 37 years, and they had not cut anything, right? So my gut instinct was in 2 or 3 years, I may be able to select cut some of that stuff out of there and leave, good stuff standing so that the next buyer can actually walk in and harvest, really mature timber. And there is mature timber on there. If I probably will have somebody come in and mark it and cut it. And then 5 years from now, when that all starts to look aesthetically better, sell it. And I took the value of X timber, but I've also left timber that has value for them to harvest in the future.
Sure.
But I do think you are seeing, per what we were talking about with the aesthetics, many of these properties that are coming up for sale are being cut right before sale is happening.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that the land isn't worth anything, because it obviously is. It just means that one major asset is depleted, and it may take 30 years for it to come back, dude, if it was done right, too.
It's an interesting situation, because like that property to the right buyer will still sell for the same amount, because that buyer doesn't realize the value of the timber that was sold.
They're just looking for recreational value.
Yeah, or whatever it is that they're just not realizing that.
So recently, we've had a string of auctions in northern Jefferson County that have basically their old coal mine ground. It was never strip mined. Okay, so I'm not talking reclaimed or unreclaimed land. It was just basically wreck ground that never got utilized. I believe maybe it was deep mined years ago. There might be water issues, I guess, would be the only negative about it. Either way, they've all been aggressively harvested in the last 10 years. Not really, I would say, no timber potential for 50 years for the most part. And these went to auction, and at the cheap end, they went for $4,000 an acre. This is steep ground. This is nothing but wreck ground. Right? And it still went, I couldn't believe, it went between 3,800, I think, low end, multiple auction after auction after auction, multiple, 30 acres to 80 acres. I don't know. I think altogether 3,000 acres might have sold, and everything went $3,800 low end, 46 high end, and it was just like all insane to me, because I don't know what you're paying for wreck ground, you're paying for a place to hunt.
Yep,
that's it.
Yep,
it's no mineral rights. Okay, which is I guess something we in this area. It's extremely valuable if you can get a property with mineral rights. It's not held by production that has potential to be produced. But wow, it's just land it's crazy right now.
Yeah,
and that's. Had it had timber on it, probably the buyer would have been somebody that realized the value of that timber, and it would have been gone pretty soon. So it's very competitive right now.
It's amazing what just the potential of land to yield value that like we never knew. Jed, I look at some of our stuff up there that's close to you, and it's like from natural gas to now, solar potential. And prior to that, I'm sure, my grandpa and stuff experience and value that they're like, man, I bought this land and I never expected it to be worth this because of this.
Right.
Whether it's people want to come hunt it, people want to put solar panels on it, people want to mine it for coal or for natural, or take timber off of it, based on that fluctuating market. It's just land is so cool in that dynamic. It's kind of like it's a secure investment, but there's opportunity for like a big yield.
Well, it's always appreciating, which is the unique thing, because they're not making any more of it, right? If anything, it's declining in the availability that's out there. But I think what's cool about it, especially from a recreational front, and it ties directly into what we're talking about with timber harvest, is that if you got I say raw piece of land, but let's say, it isn't the best timber, it's not ready to be cut, but it's also not been stripped out, you can improve that property to be a better recreational piece of ground, and thus charge more when you go back to resell it on the marketplace,
Sure.
and that is a recognized value from an investment side. And what's cool about it for guys like us, I think, and it's no knock to the market and paper money, but like it's a tangible item. Like we can get our hands on it. We can see the improvement. We can make the improvement, thus then be able to make a return on the investment. Jed, I guess a couple other questions would be, are there any other things that people can get creative with in terms of timber? I've heard rumors of people using timber as collateral to buy other pieces of property and stuff like that. I mean, have you got into any of that or any experience with that?
No.
Interesting.
No, I don't. I mean, I guess at that point you're over my head on investment stuff like that. But no,
it comes down to the lender though, right? Like, so you would have to essentially, just like a timber contract, you would have to assign a value to your timber, find a lender who's going to recognize and
put
be willing to
lean
against that. Yeah, I mean, why not? It comes down to the lender. Yeah, I suppose you could do that with any attribute of land.
Yeah, I guess I have been approached about that, and I think they always fall apart. That, hey, the bank needs an appraisal on this, and at that point, I'm doing an appraisal, and how it's being used. You're exactly right. You know, a deal between the borrower and the lender. But I don't. Just my opinion of that would be that most banks would probably be a hard no on that.
Real quick, while we're on that subject, Ed, I know I've asked you just briefly about like USDA loans, and we're looking at more. I know that loans are not your expertise. I'm just throwing this out there for all three of us here to talk about. Like, but between USDA and, you know, obviously, Jeremy, you've used some here recently. Who'd you use? Farm credit to finance yours. You know, it does seem like as, you know, the market is realizing value of some of the attributes assigned to land, we're kind of picking it apart, you know, as there's less and less of it. It does seem like there's more and more of an industry that's realizing the value, whether it's appraisers, lenders, you know, down the list of people that are willing to do things like you're talking about, lean against the timber on one property for another. But
it hasn't been my experience. I guess, you know, I've got a home equity line of credit that I will utilize every now and then if I see an opportunity. And it was astounding to me. I feel like they overvalued maybe my home and completely undervalued all my land assets to the point where they just pretended they did not exist. Okay. Like they don't want to, at least in my experience with my bank, they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to touch it. It's not to them. It's something that's an assignable value, which to me is so
that happens
wrong.
all the time, dude. Yeah. All the time.
Yeah.
You can very easily look around here and see comps consistently for land prices.
100%.
And real.
Well, dude, and that's what appraisers want to see, Jed, is comps. I think you can assist them with this. If you say, hey, you're just valuing this, like, look at this property that just sold for this, and here's what they have.
It just comes down to that bank.
When I got my appraisal back, I was like, I spent some time on the phone with the appraiser. Hey, the house, it's all you. I don't really know. You know, that's not my expertise. But I noticed here that you've got my land listed at $1,000 an acre, and I wish, you know, I wish, because I'd be buying up the county, you know? It's again, in my experience, it's not something that's at least, you know, the appraiser in my case and the bank in my case were willing to help me out on. But again, maybe farm credit or something like that, you know, that's probably what they're designed more to do.
They are. And typically what I find that they're doing, like it used to be like, man, if it didn't have a structure, there was no way in hell you were getting, you know, financing on it. Now they'll look at that raw piece, but they're basically going to appraise it for just over whatever you're buying it for. And they're going to do their research on comps, and they're going to look at the you know, the funniest part is always and you mentioned the CAUV, but you know, look at like your tax assessment on land and stuff. Like you look at this and I think it was like my insurance agent was like, yeah, I looked at your tax assessment. It says it's worth like $115,000 for this 130 acres, and you're paying like $370. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I was like, yeah, I wish it was only $115,000. Like, it would be that's sub $1,000 an acre. I was like, it doesn't exist.
You can throw those out the window. They're meaningless. I mean, they have their place for, you know, county auditors and treasurers to worry about, but they're, from our standpoint, they're meaningless.
Yeah, that's crazy, man. It's such an interesting game when you get into that. But you know, I think that there are definitely you know, new lenders that are coming up to take a look at that. But you know, ultimately, you just need to position yourself to be in the right place to say, you know, a home equity line is I think a really good option there to have that available funds for down payment if you need it, and you just got to find the right lender. Jed, I guess personal question on yours, when you're looking at some of the properties that you're buying, do you have in your mind long-term, you know, holding on to those to the timber is time to harvest, or are some of those, you know, quicker turnarounds? You know, do you have a personal preference when you see properties come up?
It just depends. It depends on where I'm at in life. It depends on how big the property is. Can I pay cash for it? How much do I need to borrow? How close is it to my core holding? If it's if it's adjacent or close to the family farm, it's going to be long-term. I can guarantee you that.
Yep.
Okay. It won't be any sort of, hell, it won't be an investment property at that point, which frankly makes it difficult sometimes because I know I'm not going to see a return on it. It's going to be part of the family farm that I'm going to pass on to the kids.
Yep.
Now, again, that's why I feel like if I go out on a couple of these properties that I've got that are, 15 miles away, I could go either way on them. And right now I'm just in a holding pattern. I'm not, on one of them, I've harvested some timber. It's going to be ready to roll again in 25 years for another harvest. I have no idea if I'm going to own it then or not. If something close comes along, I've got that there. I can sell it and make some money on it and use that to buy again local. That's my goal. My long-term goal is to build the family farm as much as possible. And at some point, realistically, I will probably have to do that is sell, the Carroll County piece in order to hopefully buy an adjacent piece around here. And even though the Carroll County piece is great, and again, I guess I feel fine about that because I know I've improved it. I know I've done the forest management where Jared and I are improving it for, it's hunting, hopefully every year as we go, and that builds value. And did 12 acres of tree planting in there last spring that, right now you wouldn't notice it. If I can get 2 or 3 more years from that, you're going to see this young stand of walnut, red oak, and swamp white oak, bur oak, and nice, good, desirable hardwoods coming up. And that, to me, is going to be a combination, great revenue 80 years down the road. But again, in the meantime, short term, it's CRP ground, basically. You've got this nice, perfect little thoroughfare and bedding for deer. Nothing but improvement.
Well, and Jed, your comment about, recreational values, like even though we haven't killed a buck off of that property yet, we've got some pretty serious trail camera intel, and the neighbor killed a freaking giant double drop tine that we called crumplehorn. That in and of itself is going to bring buyers to the table 100%. For that piece of property. So yeah, I love it. Also, one other thing you said I wanted to circle back on is, I think Jed commented, he's like, I don't know, what I'm going to buy or sell these things, as he was just saying. But in the meantime, I'm sure as heck going to manage it, because that's going to continue to add value, and whether it's Jed and his family using it and it stays a part of the family farm long term, or, ultimately that turns into, value when he turns around to sell it. I think that's a good mindset to have.
I think that's incredibly smart, because the cool thing, again, is like, and we talked about this on the first one, is never kind of outpunt your means, basically saying like, have in your mind that you have to sell this thing in the next 3 to 5 years or you're financially not going to be in a good place. If you're talking that way, you probably shouldn't have bought it to begin with.
Yeah.
If the opportunistic option comes up to sell it and to make money, great, sell it and make money.
Yeah.
But don't feel that stress.
That's the thing. So many people kind of glaze over the fact that you still have to make these payments. That's why Jed's walking 5 properties a day in the heat of summer. That's why his arms look the way that they do, is like, you still have to pay for these properties. And even though they're appraising and they have value and equity is building, you have to be able to make the payments on these things. And so
100%
work hard for it.
That's it, man. Very cool. Well, that's a good episode.
Yeah, man. Thank you for joining us, Jed. That was super insightful.
Guys, I appreciate the opportunity, and I guess just for landowners, educate yourself about, or potential land buyers, know your market. Know the areas. I mean, I'm not saying every night you got to be on Zillow and Realtor.com, but if once a month, just kind of get a feel for what stuff's going for. That way, when you see an opportunity, if it's a winner or not. But you've got to educate yourself with the markets prior to, the timber thing, gas and oil. Those are all kind of different things that potentially, you got to be knowledgeable about a little bit. But I guess invest in what you know, and don't invest if you don't know. So start doing a little bit of homework now.
And so like sorry, Jed. And like you said, your main, source of business is referrals. And so like to the potential buyers out there, if you don't know, ask. I went through the State Department is how I eventually got a hold of you, but I easily could have asked any of the other foresters or landowners, and they all would have said, hey, Jed lives 5 miles away. This is your guy. This is who you want to use. So whether it's a Google search or just talking to people that are kind of in the industry as you're looking to potentially buy or have some forestry work done on your properties that you recently acquired or have owned for a long period of time, find a good forestry consultant and use them to implement any of these practices we've talked about.
100%.
You got it. We're a tool. Use this.
Awesome, Jed.
All right, brother.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the Bought a Farm podcast, man, and thanks for dumping some timber knowledge on us. It's very helpful, and I'm sure we're gonna see some pictures from you here in the upcoming fall of tracking giants with Jared, because that tends to be what you two do. So.
Sounds good, man. Hey, thanks for having me on, guys. You guys take care.
Thanks, Jed. Appreciate it, buddy. Awesome. Episode 2 in the can.
Yeah, man. Colton and I were just commenting, like, dude, Jed is, and Jed will tell you too, he's not a podcaster. He's not like a public personality by any means, but like, obviously he is a personality, and he's knowledgeable too, man.
Well, I mean, he lays down some pretty heavy hitters. Number one, the tax basis definitely seems critically valuable.
Huge.
Number two, just getting a forester in there to talk about a management plan to really identify things in terms of hunting and habitat improvement. Giant improvement.
I don't think it can be like reiterated enough. And honestly, I got to give everybody that's ever talked about forestry practices credit. From day one, it's really been established that, like, dude, you know, these trees, it takes them 30, 40, 50 years to grow. Like, it's such a valuable resource that you can ruin in 30 seconds with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And so it's just so critically important, even though I was twisting his arm on some of that stuff, because I like to test the waters and do it myself, you know, whenever we can. But like, dude, you have to consult a forester, whether it's a state forester or a forestry consultant, you know, private one like Jed. You need to have somebody that is knowledgeable on these resources come in and at least give their input on how you need to treat them.
Well, I mean, I'm sure anybody who's done TSI, including you and I mean, we've probably, per Jed's forestry management plans, made mistakes.
100%.
Right? Like, I know even in the last 2 weeks, and my Pennsylvania place is a great example of where there was a complete disregard for any type of cutting.
Yeah.
It was probably anything that was, you know, 10-inch in diameter and up, just whacked, gone.
Your Pennsylvania place? You had timbered
7 or 8 years before I bought it.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that, it crossed my mind briefly of, like, you know, a lot of these you know, foresters or forestry crews around there are good guys and are in a lot of cases willing to clear plots of land for you. And I know you just spent a considerable amount of money getting you know, some ground clear.
$7 grand.
I don't know the state of your timber over there. I almost wonder if you're like, hey, this timber's, you know, just a few years out from harvest. If you could have said, hey, here's forestry crew, while you're in here, I also, you know, save yourself whatever, $2 grand.
And it probably wasn't, because there literally was like 2 giant beech trees.
Okay.
And like, that was it. Everything else was 6-8 inch diameter and under, you know.
So no regrets.
And yeah, no regrets. I mean, yeah, it was a considerable investment, but it gave me, I've now got 1.25 acres of food plot versus a 1/4 acre of food plot.
Yeah. Well, and due to the value of your land from an investment standpoint, you have a hunting utility on it now.
Yeah. Change the entire way that I, you know, will hunt that property. And again, that's a long-term investment on my side, but yeah, if you think about that. In fact, one of the things they did mention, and I used a really trusted friend of mine to clear that, is I was probably a year or two away from where the mulcher, the drum mulcher, would not have been effective.
Yeah, there you go.
Because the trees were getting too big.
And it would have cost you even more.
And I still had a crew of 3 guys hand chainsawing the bigger trees down, and then the mulcher actually going to it or picking it up and burning it with a skid steer. So yeah, it is a weird thing. Now, Ohio is a completely different ballgame because it literally has not been harvested in 35 plus years.
Yeah.
And so there's some real interesting places there where, yeah, I've got a lot of in that 20 diameter type trees that are probably worth something now, you know, and there's several of them or a bunch of them in an area to where I could easily just say, like, if I'm looking at the crowns, like, I probably should take half of these out and leave the other half to grow bigger and get more sunlight to the ground.
Yeah.
That's where you need a guy like Jed to come in and tell you that, or reaffirm your decision on that.
And dude, you can learn. Like, you're not ever going to know what Jed knows, but when Jed comes in, or, you know, another forestry consultant comes in and marks trees for you, ask them a question. Say, hey, why are you marking these trees this way? Yeah, ask them that. Why are you marking it this way? And it's a case study in and of itself. You can say, oh, okay, you just gave me an education on my property, and you're never, like I said, going to be able to use that, go to another property and say, oh, $30,000 worth of timber here. Yep. But you can say, okay, I've got a rough idea of what he did on the last place, and I kind of know what I got from that harvest, and you can make your own assessment.
It's super valuable in that for a few things. First of all, if you look at what it would cost probably to have a consulting forester come out and cruise your timber to give you an accurate value of what the cost is.
Dude, I'll just tell you, right out of the get-go, Jed did it for free. Just because of how I reached out to him. I told him I was passionate about deer hunting. He's like, yeah, dude, you're close. I'll swing by and do it for free.
Well, and it's because at some point you probably would go back to him and have him do the timber sale.
Their end game is timber sales. That's how they make money.
That's how they make
and
their
it's on
money.
Commission. It's not money out of your pocket necessarily. It's out of the timber sale.
Yeah. And so I think that even if for a nominal amount to come and do that, that now becomes an asset, especially if you're talking about investment properties, which often in I Bought a Farm, we are talking investment properties, to have when you sell that property in 5, 6, 7, 8 years in your hand to say, I had this cruised in 2022, it says there's 250 grand in timber on this property. If you're selling it at 450, that basically means all the rest of the property in use is just 200,000 if they came in and clear cut it.
Yeah, dude. And the subliminal thing that kind of doesn't get addressed, and there's no way to assign a dollar value to it. But if you're looking to sell a piece of property eventually, and you go, you're having conversations with the buyer or through an agent, and you show them like, hey, here's all these things that I've did. Not only do they say, oh, okay, there's $50,000 worth of timber here that they've accounted
100%.
for. This person cares about this piece of property. They've taken very good care of it. They've managed it actively for the past 5, 10 years. I've got confidence now as a buyer that this thing was treated right.
I think the big thing too that I've seen, at least when you start to do those timber cruises, is, and this is at least my case, is certain trash trees, I guess, in my mind, trash trees, like I don't have a problem cutting. But when I get into like a thick stack of oaks and cherries or, anything along that, I've got a tough time cutting trees, like just mentally, because I'm like, man, like I don't know about this or I don't know about this. And I need somebody like a Jed who's knowledgeable in that format to reassure me like, hey, you know what? You were right. You do not want to cut these 4 trees because that's where they're going to grow. But these 2, let's get rid of.
It's hard, man. Like you said, there's some areas that are obvious, but even to an experienced forester or somebody that's done a lot of cutting, dude, it's like, I don't know, drawing a circle freehand versus doing it with like a stencil. It's like to have some kind of framework laid out before you're in the heat of the moment with a chainsaw. Dude, it's easy to put a saw down and pull the trigger and start cutting trees down.
Well, and also keep in mind, even if it's an investment property that's 5 to 7 years, or if it's a long-term property that's 20 plus, one of the big things that I've kind of had to evaluate is, and it differs with everyone, is like even a consulting forester may say, hey, listen, like this giant red oak is awesome. Like it's at 75 cents board feet. You're getting $750 for this tree, right? Evaluate it. If you're like, man, I don't have any, like this is the core red oak of my property, don't fucking cut it.
Yeah.
Just don't cut it.
Yeah, don't cut it.
And I've had that. Like I've had somebody in Kentucky come and look at my property and say, well, these white oaks all need some time, but these white oaks can go, and man, that giant red oak, that's worth $1,000. And it's like, yeah, but there's nothing bigger than that red oak on my entire property. Like that tree has been there for 100 plus years.
I think that's a good statement in general. Like, dude, when in doubt, don't cut it. Whether it's, just an old valuable tree. If you like the way that it looks, like, dude, it's money versus, there's more than money, on these farms. They should be valued that way. The other one is, dude, tree stand trees. Like, not like you necessarily have the ability to go through and say, oh, it's a perfect stand tree. But in some cases, you may have a valuable tree that's your only option to hunt a certain area.
Yep.
And so you have a decision to make. And I would say, when in doubt, don't cut it.
Well, and so when you said about that crew coming in and cutting on my place and clearing,
especially around the edges of the food plot, you probably got to be super careful.
Well, on that edge backside, those were where I did have like a very few amount of 15 to 20 inch diameter oaks. And so before those guys came in, I marked those and I said, this is your stop line. Do not cut these. And it gave me a corridor behind the plot where these deer use a lot too. But it's also because I don't have a ton of oaks on my property. Like you're sure as hell not cutting one of these down. And so, I think as you start to look at your property, you'll figure out those options. There's no doubt though that an investment and a phone call to a consulting forester to come and get them on your property, even if it starts with a management plan and eventually ends with a timber cruise, that doesn't mean you're committed to sell. It just means that you know what the value of that timber is worth when you're ready to sell, if you're ready to sell.
Yeah. I mean, dude, take it from my personal experience. Like, you may just get a forester to come out and give you an accurate appraisal or a value. You may make a lifelong friend, who you end up killing giant bucks with.
Who lets you kill giant bucks on his property.
That's right.
That's a whole nother level of
you never know. So reach out, just, make friends with these people, man. You want to build a relationship. The more people, I mean, dude, that's anything in business or anything in land ownership. If you have relationships with the right people and you treat them good, ultimately that comes back to you in the value of your land and in so much more.
Well, and in the concept of what we're talking about in terms of buying farm, who better to have as a contact in your back pocket than the guy who's looking at a lot of different properties
100%.
all the time to say, hey, Jared, you know what? I found this place. I'm not buying it, but it's probably worth something.
It's happened.
Yes. Yeah. That's the way to do it, man. That's the way to look at it. So we appreciate everyone listening to this episode of I Bought a Farm, episode 2 with Jed Coldwell, consulting forester in Ohio. Hopefully you guys picked up some pretty good tips and, just continue learning on the process. Eventually we'll figure this thing out.
Yeah. Value that timber, man. Just, I think the whole point of this specific episode here is like, just if nothing else, understand that there is value associated with timber on your property, on other people's property. Take it into consideration. Put it in your back pocket. You don't have to know every single facet of it. Obviously, use a forester for that. But there is value in your timber for whitetails, and for financial reasons as well. So use that.
That's it, man. We'll see you guys next week.
Later.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode of the I Bought a Farm podcast, make sure you check it out every other Thursday night on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and any other place that you might find your favorite podcast.